My name is Sarah Fernando, and my pronouns are she and her. I am the manager for the County of Santa Clara Office of LGBTQ Affairs. The Office of LGBTQ Affairs provides leadership and support for the well-being and longevity for LGBTQ communities in Santa Clara County so that our communities can thrive. This project is really personal to me because it helps us identify some of the challenges and barriers of trans, non-binary, and gender expansive folks here in Santa Clara County. I hope the data and the research allows us to understand what those experiences are and the importance of lived experiences to be able to inform what we need to do to make our workplaces, our institutions, the spaces that we have more inclusive. These are the experiences that are out there, and it's going to be up to all of us to be able to make sure that the workplace is affirming for everybody. I would like to introduce the staff at Community Marketing Insights to go over the results. This video is a short summary of the results. A full written report will be available at our Office of LGBTQ Affairs website.
Thank you so much, Sarah. My name is David Paisley, and I am a research director here at Community Marketing Insights. My pronouns are he, him, his. For those of you not familiar with us, CMI is an LGBTQ owned and operated research firm based here in California. The company's been around for about 30 years, and I've actually been on staff for 25 years. And now I'm going to turn it over to Kimberly.
Thank you so much, David. My name is Dr. Kimberly Balsam, and my pronouns are she, her, or they, them. I'm a senior researcher with CMI. I'm also a professor of clinical psychology, and I've been doing research with LGBTQ+ communities for the past 25 years, more recently focusing on trans and non-binary communities. The title of this study is the Santa Clara County Transgender, Non-Binary, and Gender Expansive Employment Study. This was a research study that was commissioned by the County of Santa Clara Office of LGBTQ Affairs. We included participants with a wide range of gender identities within these categories, but in this presentation and in the accompanying report, we will use the acronym TGNB to refer to our participant population.
Thank you, Kimberly. I'd like to start off with just a quick introduction about the methodology of the research, but also the participants. First, a big thank you to the 234 transgender, non-binary, intersex, and gender expansive community members that participated in the research, all either lived or worked in Santa Clara County. We recruited the research participants in a number of ways. We used the email and social media lists of Community Marketing Insights and also the County of Santa Clara Office of LGBTQ Affairs. We placed paid advertising on Facebook, Instagram, Craigslist, and the Bay Area Reporter. We also asked 100 local nonprofit agencies and health providers to assist in distributing the survey. All the outreach materials and the survey itself was in 5 languages. The research included not only an online survey, but we also did 6 focus groups, and we also had 30 individual in-depth interviews of the participants. And all that data was collected between November 2021 and April 2022. We should also say that participants were paid a stipend to complete the 30-minute survey and also for their participation in the focus groups and in-depth interviews. I also want to say that in this video report, we're going to include some of the participants who agreed to share some of their thoughts and experiences in this video. I also want to give a little bit of information about the research participants. The participants aged and ranged between 18 and 70, but it should be said that the participants did trend younger with this, and that is very common with LGBTQ and also transgender and non-binary research. The group included people that had a transgender identity, a non-binary identity, and many identified as both. The group also included people identified as intersex, and those people also identified as either transgender or non-binary. The group was really quite diverse by race and ethnicity, and we had 62% of the participants were BIPOC. 86% of the participants were residents of Santa Clara County, with an additional 14% which were residents of neighboring counties but worked in Santa Clara County, and just under half of the participants lived in the city of San Jose. I also should say that almost half the participants, or 46%, had a bachelor's degree or higher, and I'll talk about that a little bit in the next slide. Before we move on to the core of the results, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the employment, income, and financial stability of the participants. Overall, we found the participants' median individual income at $34,000 to be really quite low for Santa Clara County. And that's especially true considering the high average educational attainment of the participants, as we discussed in the last slide. I think these income levels really do suggest pervasive unemployment, underemployment, and discrimination. And we'll discuss that a lot more in the rest of the research. Most of the participants indicated they are financially struggling or are doing just well enough to get by. Only 30% felt that they were financially secure. Looking at employment, 44% of the participants worked full-time and 24% worked part-time. I think importantly, 12% were unemployed or looking for a job. And in the context, during the time in this research was done, only about 3% of the residents of Santa Clara County were unemployed. So it's a big jump for the transgender and non-binary participants.
This next section is about anti-TGNB employment discrimination, or employment discrimination that's based on gender identity. So a take-home point here is that anti-TGNB employment discrimination is indeed happening in Santa Clara County. In fact, 70% of our participants had experienced anti-TGNB discrimination in the workplace, or they weren't sure if they'd experienced it. And during the interviews and focus groups, many participants explained further that oftentimes they suspected that anti-TGNB discrimination had occurred, but there's often no way to tell for sure or to prove it. Discrimination also occurs in the job search process. And in fact, about a quarter of our participants said that they were frequently rejected by potential employers when looking for a job without any explanation, even when they were clearly qualified for the job. Also, about a quarter of our participants have been told directly by potential employers that they weren't going to be hired for a particular job because of their gender identity and/or their gender expression. Despite the high levels of experiences of discrimination, only about 24% of participants had reported this discrimination to a supervisor, manager, or an HR department. And there are a lot of different reasons for this. Participants expressed a lot of concerns about judgment or retaliation, or even just being labeled as a problematic employee if they were to make a report. And many participants expressed a wish for the county to have a safe and centralized and really clear place that they could report anti-TGNB discrimination. It's also really important to think about intersectionality when discussing discrimination. And in fact, our BIPOC participants experienced discrimination based on their race and ethnicity, as well as their gender identity in the workplace, with nearly half of all BIPOC participants and 69% of Black participants in particular experiencing racial discrimination in the workplace within the past 5 years. BIPOC participants also reported some more difficulties finding a job and reported more of a need for support services to further their career and educational goals.
My name is Liana Vibes. I'm a non-cisgender person, specifically intersex, with a transitional background. It's interesting because I feel like my gender experience is taken as a personal attack. I always say it's like, I didn't run over your dog. I didn't hurt you as a person. Like, my gender experience has nothing to do about a person's livelihood. But they like to hyper-focus on what my past is and what my gender journey is. And it's so inappropriate because it reduces me to something so minuscule, so minimal, so minimized.
My name is Jax, and I go by they, them. I've realized in the Santa Clara area that the job hiring process is always a little difficult just due to knowing that I am in the category of a non-binary person, and knowing that the minute that I disclose that I'm non-binary, I'm automatically I know a good 50% of my applicants are going to give me a no callback. Just knowing that kind of gives, how do I explain, like a kind of disappointment. But yeah, sometimes I'm even I put she just so that to see if it'll push my application through. But I've noticed that might help. A few times I get a call back, but then of course upon meeting me, they're shocked at how I look, and they're like, well, you said she, and I'm like, well, had I said non-binary, would I still have gotten chosen? Is kind of the thing.
My name is Michaela, and my pronouns are she, her. And the worst part is that it's very, very difficult to prove that discrimination during an interview. All the employer has to say is we found a candidate more qualified, or the candidate didn't have a skill set that we were looking for. And there's really no way for us to prove otherwise. And a lot of companies now have gone to the point where they won't even provide you feedback. They'll just say that they went in another direction. And even though you personally feel that you've been discriminated against, we can't go to a court, we can't go to anybody legally about the issue because we don't have any hard proof. And so we become a victim that has no voice and has no way to prove it, to make changes in the industry. So I think it's important to not only have a streamlined process, but to have the information readily available so that victims or people that perceive that they've been discriminated against feel that they have power in the situation. A lot of times when you don't have that information available or you don't know where to go, it can feel very daunting. It can feel like you do not have a voice. It could feel like there's nowhere for you to go to get the help you need or to fight for your specific right.
Most participants had neutral to positive sentiments about living and working in Santa Clara County. However, just under half said that the county is really a supportive place to work as a TGNB person. Overall, participants perceive Santa Clara County as somewhat less TGNB affirming than some other Bay Area counties like San Francisco and Alameda County, but definitely see it as much better in terms of support for TGNB people than most other parts of the United States. There were three major concerns about Santa Clara County that came up for participants. The first was the high cost of living and housing insecurity in Santa Clara County. The second was a feeling that the county's LGBTQ and TGNB communities could be more visible and organized. And finally, participants discussed some discrepancies between the rural parts of the county that they perceived as being less TGNB affirming than San Jose and some of the cities within Silicon Valley. Overall, the County of Santa Clara as a government entity received positive to neutral sentiments from participants in terms of its response to the needs of TGNB community members. But it's important to note that participants discussed many ways in which the County of Santa Clara can improve.
Hi, my name is Kim. Any pronouns with respectful intent. Santa Clara County is doing fairly well. I don't believe that other counties, especially maybe Central California, would have nearly as many opportunities for trans and non-binary people.
My name is Josiah. My pronouns are he, him, his. Overall, in the Bay Area, housing insecurity is a big problem for all communities. But the way that I see that, San Jose can directly impact that for the transgender and non-binary community is set aside certain funding, specific funding for housing programs that are directed at and for transgender and non-binary community, whether it be specific housing or vouchers. But there need to be a program that is specifically designed for the transgender, non-binary folks of that community.
Hi, my name is April, and I use they, them pronouns. I've been a Santa Clara County resident my whole life, and over the years, I've definitely seen improvement. I love living here, but Santa Clara County could always use improvement in regards to transgender and non-binary people.
Hi, my name is Isaac, and my pronouns are he, him. I have lived in Santa Clara County my entire life, and it has been a great place to grow up and transition in. I am extremely grateful that I am lucky enough to live in not only California, but we live in the Silicon Valley. So with that being said, we as a county are very up to date on how to support the fast changing world. Of course, there's always room for improvement on how to make our community a more accepting place.
I think one of the most important findings in the research is the level of reports of harassment and violence against transgender and non-binary people in the workplace. It's far more common in Santa Clara County than many might think. Looking at the chart, we see percentages that indicate these types of violence and harassment were common for past employments, and that may have happened in different states or regions. It may happen, many years ago. But I think is what more striking to me is the levels of reported of harassment and violence at current jobs here in Santa Clara County right now. Harassment and violence against transgender and non-binary workers is happening right now in Santa Clara counties. And really, when we look at these percentage in the light blue column, they should be zero, but they're not, right? Also, over a quarter of participants reported fearing for their safety in their workplace due to their gender identity at some point in the past. But again, 10% reported these feelings about their current employment situation. Again, it should be zero, but it was at 10%. I think one of the core components of this research was discussions about how far a person can really come out in the workplace and express their authentic selves without a risk of being victimized.
There are plenty of negative experiences when you're working in the workforce as a non-cisgender person. The more kind of obvious ones are bullying, discrimination, and hate, but violence can also be part of the picture too. It's sad and unfortunate, but it comes with the reality of living your life authentically or living your life visibly as who you are.
My name is Ashani. My pronouns are they, them, theirs, or ze, them, zers. So something that trans and non-binary folks often struggle with in a job, especially when they are working at a location in office, if there are few or inaccessible all-gender restrooms, folks are then forced to choose a gendered restroom. And when they do, oftentimes, especially if there hasn't been enough staff training, they end up in confrontations with other staff members who may be uncomfortable with their presence in a bathroom or don't want them there, despite the fact that both parties have every right to use that space.
And I remember that I was getting bullied and discriminated against very harshly. This manager took it out of their time to sit those individuals down and say, this is wrong, as so much that when it persisted, those individuals were fired. Furthermore, this manager, essentially hired on a diversity inclusion workshop where every team member in the store had to attend. It was mandatory. When practical advice that an HR or hiring manager can do is to state verbatim, we take harassment at every level that's important to us, that we don't take that lightly. We have a zero tolerance policy towards this, gender identity, gender expression, whatever, what have you. Again, to use languages and words that are encompassing of those who are non-cisgender and the community itself.
I also want to talk a little bit more about microaggressions, misgendering, and pronoun use. So in the workplace, transgender and non-binary participants need to deal with almost continual microaggressions, misgendering, and a misuse of pronouns. And this was really common in all aspects of employment. It's happening in the job search process, it's happening in the interview process, and it's happening on the job. And just a few statistics here, 67% of participants have been misgendered in a job interview. 45% are experiencing microaggressions from coworkers in their current job in Santa Clara County, and 36% are experiencing it from a supervisor right now. At their current job, 41% have been misgendered verbally in workplace conversations at work. So, in summary, I think microaggressions, misgendering, and misuse of pronouns is sort of a constant battle for the transgender and non-binary research participants in the workplace. And it's something that they need to deal with on a day-to-day basis.
Well, a negative that I had in the workplace was I actually, from a superior, got a question about my gender identity and saying kind of, why are you a girl, or why are you a boy, or why do you choose to be or look the way you look? And I always felt that was a weird, awkward space that I had to come in and work in from, the future with that person. And it just really pinpointed me out in the workplace in the future with that person.
I've had several people In my workplace, misgender me or use the wrong pronouns, I tend to correct them. And if they're genuinely apologetic and they didn't do it on purpose, weren't trying to be, subtly transphobic, then I move on. It's not really that big of a deal. But if it keeps happening and it starts to seem more, malicious, then that's when I would have a problem and I would have to talk to somebody about it.
Trans people have to work so hard to ensure their safety, but we as a community need employers to start taking accountability and start educating themselves on how to respect trans people as a whole, without putting that burden on trans people to constantly explain themselves when that's not necessary. They don't need to work so hard to justify their existence.
Looking for a new job can be stressful for any person, but TGNB people experience some unique stressors related to their gender identity when they're looking for a job, on top of the typical things that are stressful about looking for a new job. Participants described a number of these different stressors, including deciding if and how they should disclose their gender identity in the hiring process. Participants also talked about the difficulty in explaining their prior work history and their resume when it was associated with a dead name. And often they had to educate hiring managers about gender identity related issues instead of focusing on the job that they were applying to. Many participants received inappropriate questions and comments about their gender identity during the application process and during interviews, and oftentimes had their lived experience ignored as a job qualification, whereas instead hiring managers would focus on things like formal education and formal work history. It's important to note that 76% of our participants who had difficulty finding work in their field attribute this at least a little bit to their gender identity. And many participants avoided applying for jobs because of their concern about that particular workplace, that they wouldn't be accepted there as a TGNB person. The vast majority of our participants indicated that their TGNB identity has influenced their choice of a career or job path at least a little bit. And for nearly half of our participants, it really had a large influence on our career path. So I think these findings really emphasize how important it is to understand TGNB identities in the workplace.
One of the easiest ways an employer can make a trans or non-binary applicant feel at ease is to include pronouns in their email signature. It doesn't take much effort, but it lets us know that this is probably a safer place to apply.
When posting for a job position, it's not enough to say we're an equal opportunity employer. That's so vague, and what does that even mean? I believe that there is importance in saying that we don't discriminate upon gender identity, gender presentation, or gender expression, etc. Words are very valuable. Sapir-Whorf says that language creates reality. What reality are you choosing in the words that you choose to express and the ones you don't express?
One of the negative things that I've seen and concerns that I have, a lot of the applications, when filling them out, don't ask for a person's preferred name. A lot of transgender folks may not have gotten their name legally changed, or maybe in the process of having that happen, but their legal name may not match their preferred name. And there are a lot of applications that do not have that preferred name option or that pronoun option on the application. And so that's a concern. And it's been a concern in the community for quite some time, because just because my ID says one thing, that may not be what I want folks to address me as.
So when it comes to interviewing, I've found that it could be a double-edged sword. There have been interviews that I've gone on where I've presented as myself. And unfortunately, if you're a transgender person that hasn't had the opportunity to legally change your name, you're going to first hit a wall when you walk in that door for an in-person or during a Zoom. And they're expecting a image or a person that's going to match the name that they see on the interview. And when they don't, they have a very visible reaction. Usually it's surprise, but for some people in my past, I've encountered where they feel a little bit off-put, or they don't seem as friendly or as welcoming. And so you really have to weigh the cost to you as an applicant or an interviewer on whether or not you want to present and be yourself and face that and have it be something that's used against you.
Next, I'd like to talk about affirming work environments. And participants highlighted some of their positive workplace experiences and gave suggestions on how employers can be more affirming. Many of these suggestions will be covered later in this research in the recommendation section. But I do want to point out that not 65% of participants indicated being very or somewhat satisfied with their current or most recent job. However, participants had a higher satisfaction with their current job than the previous job, which is most likely an indication that they have actively sought out more affirming workplaces. And that's an important point for an employer for retaining employees in this competitive job market. On this slide, I do want to point out the right-hand side. And I think what is striking to me is that the basic personal respect was really the most important qualification for a supportive employer. And that should be a given. But unfortunately, many transgender and non-binary employees do not work in settings that provide this sort of basic attribute of the workplace. So something like friendly environment or professional respect rank much higher than some of these other attributes. I want to talk about maybe 5 attributes that were also very important. The first one is the development and enforcement of non-discrimination policies. Very important, obviously. But what the key word here is enforcement. And many of the participants stressed that while the policies existed in their workplace, no one was really enforcing it in their workplace. The second attribute I want to talk about that was very important, you see, is health insurance. I'm going to wait until later on that one because we have a whole section on healthcare and mental health care. The third attribute is diversity training. So workplaces should include mandatory diversity training that includes gender identity and gender expression. Only about half of the participants indicated working at a workplace that has this type of training. And another thing is that supervisors need to have more specific and more in-depth training on how to handle negative experiences or discrimination experiences that occur amongst employees. That was a real criticism of the participants, is they felt, again, although this diversity training existed, when a negative experience did happen in the workspace, supervisors were sort of ill-equipped to actually respond appropriately. Restrooms was another important attribute of an affirming work environment. Participants emphasized the importance of employees being allowed to use the restroom that aligns with their gender identity. All gender restrooms are really important throughout the workplace and particularly important for non-binary employees. Participants discussed that restrooms are actually a pretty vulnerable place for transgender and non-binary employees. That is often a place where attacks and harassment or anti-TGMB hate speech occurs. So paying attention to restroom policy and giving options is going to be very important in any workspace. And finally, on this slide, I'd like to talk about LGBTQ plus inclusion. That happens on different ways depending on the size of the employer. I think for large and small employers, LGBTQ inclusion may include just things like affirmations like rainbow flags and safe space stickers, or maybe sponsoring local LGBTQ nonprofits. For bigger employers, they often have ERGs, which include an employment research group for the LGBTQ employees. And for some larger employers, they have ERGs specifically for trans and non-binary employees.
Gender affirming workplace appreciates me for who I am, not just tolerates, but is actively happy to have me as part of their team. Because different perspectives and different identities can make a much more well-rounded workplace.
So to be supported in employment, trans and non-binary youth need interviewers who are accepting of any kind of gender expression. They need companies that are willing and able to support gender expression and identity outside of the binary. That includes things like policies around bathroom use, code of conduct, dress, making sure that policies are not strictly in alignment with just two genders. Trans and non-binary youth, when seeking employment, need employers that are transparent about what their health insurance does and does not cover, especially while they are in that transitional time in their lives, seeking to enter into full adulthood and get the resources they need to make sure they are still able to affirm themselves and their identities.
I think some key factors in having an affirming workplace is just having that support from your employer and not being scared to be yourself. It's really important that a support system is in place for you, because if you're not going to feel supported, you're not going to work as efficiently.
Actually, where I currently am has done an amazing job with it. They have a program for DEAI, diversity, equality, acceptance, and inclusivity. So it's required training for everybody who works there. This has been the most supportive place I've ever worked at, and I'm really happy to be there.
This next slide focuses on transitioning in the workplace. So first, I'm going to define transitioning. So transition refers to behaviors, processes, or procedures that a TGNB individual may choose to engage in to affirm their gender identity. So transition is usually talked about in terms of three different components. Medical transition refers to medical procedures such as hormones or surgery. Legal transition refers to changing legal documentation such as legal name or gender marker. And finally, social transition refers to other changes that a person might make to live in their affirmed gender, such as pronouns, name, style of hair or clothing, and other forms of expression of gender in everyday life. Every person's transition is unique, and transition really isn't linear. There's no specific order that people follow, and TGNB people might engage in some components of transition and not others. So it's really important to understand this process on an individual basis. Transition is really important in thinking about trans and non-binary people's employment. In this research, the vast majority of our participants, or 80%, have transitioned socially, medically, and/or legally while they were employed. And participants really talked about the importance of having a supportive workplace and having policies in place that can assist employees who are transitioning, particularly in terms of healthcare coverage that includes gender-affirming medical services. Given how important this was and how many of our participants had engaged in transition while they're employed, this really means that employers and HR departments need to have some knowledge about transition-related topics and really have policies in place to assist employees who are transitioning.
I transitioned in tech, and the company was rather supportive. It went well in the regards that my manager and my team did their best to quickly adopt my pronouns, my name change. The company was very happy with me sending a more public announcement, so those that I interacted with would be able to address me properly. Within short order, I mean, there were a few hurdles. It wasn't necessarily the easiest process just because I didn't know where to go and who to contact. But I was able to change my name in, I would say, 95% of the databases that are used by that company. Obviously, there are some that just cannot change until I have a legal name change, such as payroll, taxes, anything, benefits. Those all have to still be linked to my legal name. But for the most part, the transition was rather seamless. It was, in general, very supported, and I felt that I could be myself without too much reprisal. On the other hand, I think all transgender persons who do transition in the workplace need to be prepared for those that are not going to be as supportive.
An employer who has clear-cut written policies on what to do when an employee transitions can make you feel safer about coming out at work because you know that there's already practices in place to get your name changed for payroll purposes and potentially education for other staff so that you are treated respectfully as you go through transition.
Particularly health insurance was very important for our participants. The majority of our participants reported that they do have some kind of health insurance, but it is important to note that only 41% of participants are currently receiving health insurance through their employer. And a key component for TGNB people in the workplace is having insurance that covers gender-affirming medical care, focusing on transition-related coverage, as I discussed in the last slide. In fact, 94% of our participants said that health insurance is at least somewhat important when they're looking for a job, and many of our participants felt that this was extremely important when they're looking for a new job. When we asked participants if they currently have gender-affirming medical services in their health insurance, most of them did, but some participants didn't, and some really weren't sure or discussed some difficulties accessing those benefits and policies that weren't really clear. Another important thing to note is that mental health care is extremely important to TGNB community members. And we know from lots and lots of other research studies nationally that mental health problems can be somewhat elevated among trans and non-binary populations, but it's really important to note that this isn't in any way an inherent part of being TGNB, but in fact, mental health challenges are really understandable in the context of all of the victimization, discrimination, and ongoing stigma that TGNB people face in society.
As we begin to finish up this research overview, we'd like to talk about 3 additional insights. The first one is about technology companies. As Silicon Valley is part of Santa Clara County, there was much discussion of the role of the tech industry. Many felt overall that the large tech companies have done a good job in offering transgender and non-binary inclusive benefits. Many felt they're leaders as far as benefits and policies. But on the other hand, there was a concern that in certain companies and also within certain work groups within the large companies, transgender and non-binary employees are not socially accepted, can often get very isolated, frequently face misgendering or microaggressions, and an overall a feeling that there is a lack of opportunities for promotion. Another area of work is customer service jobs, and retail and customer service jobs have special considerations. Often these companies have very supportive policies and interactions amongst the employees and also within the company. However, there's little control over abusive statements and behaviors from the customers. Participants in these customer service roles really felt vulnerable because there's an attitude that the customer is always right, and this attitude sometimes excuses abusive client behavior. Further, many felt that their supervisor or store manager had zero training or direction on how to respond to abusive customers, and this led to further isolating the transgender and non-binary employees. And finally, talking about working for self, many transgender non-binary employees, after facing years of discrimination, often end up working for themselves. And in this research, 17% of participants worked for themselves. We heard from many self-employed participants that working for themselves allows them to avoid some of the discrimination they experience in the workforce. It also helped participants take control of their income, work saving, and it really created a more positive work experiences. However, many of these participants were doing short-term gig work, which wasn't really well paid. But they still saw that as a best option than facing discrimination in hiring in the workplace. It was interesting that when asked about future career goals, 25% of the participants wished to start or expand their own business.
I think working in retail in general can be exhausting dealing with the general public, but more specifically as a trans person, I have to deal with harassment almost from customers because they feel as if they are always right. And there have been a couple instances where I've been blatantly misgendered straight to my face.
Yes, I am self-employed, and that was out of necessity because after having entered the workforce and working for many brands, I found that there was so much tumultuous experiences that are alongside that, there's a lot of risks involved. Namely, like once you're onboarded and you're working with others, naturally, like someone's history comes out. You know, the longer you work in a place, the more that certain details about your past may come out, and you never know who might react in a very negative way. In positive experiences, I found friends and allies. In negative experiences, a person would threaten my life.
Based on input from trans and non-binary community members in Santa Clara County, the study identified dozens of recommendations for promoting employment success for trans and non-binary people, both in terms of looking for a job and on the job. These recommendations are divided into three broad categories. First of all, we have recommendations for actions to be taken by the County of Santa Clara as a government entity. Second, we have recommendations for actions to be taken by entities within Santa Clara County, such as nonprofits, schools, and supportive agencies. The County of Santa Clara may be involved in programs through funding or support. Finally, we have lots of recommendations for actions to be taken by local companies and employers within Santa Clara County. Please download the report and review the specific recommendations. We want to emphasize, in conclusion, that improving the employment opportunities and success of trans and non-binary people in Santa Clara County is really a community-wide effort. The full written report is available by visiting the website for the County of Santa Clara Office of LGBTQ Affairs, and we have the URL right here.
Thank you so much, Kimberly, for providing an overview of the report recommendations. I encourage everyone to visit the County of Santa Clara Office of LGBTQ Affairs and download the full report. And now I'm going to turn it over to many of the research participants and then to Sarah to give final comments.
As a business, when was the last time you hired a non-cisgender person? It's very important to have some sort of like affirmative action to let those who feel invisible to be visible.
I think that Santa Clara County could do a larger scale outreach program to help trans and non-binary people find employment that is more likely to be friendly, potentially job fairs or a vetting process so that we know which employers might be safe.
I think that the fact that the county is reviewing this, I think that the county is giving a voice to this and that they're trying to make changes, or at least they give the impression that they're open to making good changes, is really beneficial and really great. I'm happy to hear about it. And I look forward to seeing what comes of it. Hopefully the county will step up and be a leader in transgender care, in employment and rights.
We could help normalize using proper pronouns and chosen names. I wish all forms that we ever had to fill out had options for us. It's a little disheartening day after day to always have to navigate the gender binary and not be recognized.
I believe non-cisgender people have a lot to offer in workplaces. Their unique perspectives adds something very valuable to work as well as to the bottom line and to a company's goals. Because when non-cisgender people are able to tap into their unique abilities and strengths and overcome the extreme negativity society puts on us, we can thrive. Most importantly, we will thrive.
I take this data very personally, thinking about myself as a queer, trans woman of color. Is that shared experience where we get misgendered or dead named, the experience when we go through the hiring process and feeling that sense of anxiety, hoping that you don't get dead named or just clocked for being someone of trans lived experience, right? This feeling of not belonging in the workplace, this feeling of having anxiety, or this feeling of just like not being able to bring your 100% authentic self to work. It's tough to hear because I myself always question, like, Was it my gender identity, or was it how I expressed myself? Is that what caused me not to get a job? Is my level of expertise, despite being very well qualified, what is it about me? And it's this always thinking about, like, what did I do wrong? And I think what we need to do is we need to tell everybody, it's like, you did nothing wrong. What's wrong is that the way the system is created, whether it's the hiring process, whether it's people obtaining a job, getting your promotion, we do nothing wrong. And all we have at the end of the day is our qualifications, how human we are. I just hope that this report, as much as it resonates with me, I hope it just resonates with folks that want to do better, that want to be stronger allies, that want to be that force of change. That's the purpose of this report. There's always this piece when it comes to hiring or recruiting, and it's just like, yeah, we want to get as many diverse folks that we have. The question is, what are you going to be doing to retain them? Because you'll see the beauty that trans people bring to the workplace by hiring them. I just want to thank the folks at Community Marketing Insights for their expertise, to David and Tom and Kimberly and the team at CMI being able to work with our Office of LGBTQ Affairs in making sure that we capture as much participants as we can. Big shout out to the Gender Health Center. It takes an entire village to be able to have this kind of work completed. The LGBTQ service providers and community-based organizations that were open to amplifying the work that we do here at the Office of LGBTQ Affairs.